But there is a common, I don't want to say phrase, a common anecdote that I heard. So before I came here to Mexico, I was working with unhoused populations in Oakland, California, where I'm from. Um, and that phrase is, look at Portugal. Portugal decriminalized drug use and overdoses went down, and we're just trying to keep people alive. And there's a very triage like atmosphere. And when you work in homeless services, first of all, it's a field that nobody wants to work in. You reported it, so you're dealing with probably a lot of ex felons that are coming out of prison. It's the only job they can get where they can make a decent amount of money, and you're also dealing with a lot of ex addicts, maybe even people that might have excelled in some sort of housing program that someone said, "Oh, we can give this person a job because they won't steal everything." Um, and the harm reduction thing, even for them, is a big contradiction and confusing, especially if they kind of cold turkeyed their sobriety, because they're going to see it as not so much a bridge to sobriety, but more of a crutch to addiction. And you pointed out something about Portugal that never really gets spoken about, which is it didn't succeed the way people think it did. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to understand about what's called the Portuguese model is that it's the first myth, I think, to dispel about the Portuguese model is that they didn't just decriminalize drugs and hand out needles and say like, all right, that's the Portuguese model, and somehow, by doing that, we've managed to get people to get clean and lower the addicted population and reduce overdoses. That's not the case. That was decriminalization was part of the effort, but the larger part of the effort and the successful part of the effort was the addiction services and the compulsory treatment that said, all right, here's the option. You can
Mhm.
go into a housing program where you're going to get treatment to get sober, or you can avoid that, pay the fee, get back on the street, and eventually go to jail. And it was given to people as a choice of what they sort of want to do. And while that aspect of the model existed, the decriminalization was a complement because it basically said, we're not going to just start arresting people and throwing them in jail. We're going to wait until people sort of seek out services, and then we're going to give them the kinds of choices that can help them make, sobriety choices, right?
Mhm.
When that was the model, it was successful. It managed to bring down overdose rates. It managed to bring down addiction rates. It managed to get people into stable housing, get people into stable jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So for a period, that was the model. But I think the problem is when that came over to the United States by way of people reading stuff on the internet, it seems like, it doesn't seem like many people who advocated it have ever been to Portugal. Actually, know for a fact that some of the Arden people who pushed forward Measure 110, which was their big decriminalization measure, not a
Mhm.
single one of them had been to Portugal after campaigning on this for months about how they're doing the Portuguese model. None of them had
Mhm.
been to Portugal. And when the measure finally passed, uh, there was a total confusion as to how this was actually supposed to help anybody because they didn't actually understand what it was they were doing. So the model that got sort of translated into the American version of the Portuguese model was simply decriminalize drug use
Mhm.
and hand out needles. And somehow, some way, this was meant to be a kind of compassionate response that would allow people to, you know, use their freedom to get free. And it's, baffling. I mean, you worked with the homeless in
Yeah.
where in San Francisco and Oakland.
Oakland.
Yeah, you worked with the homeless in Oakland. I mean, you know, what does addiction look like among homeless encampments? Does it look like people?
It doesn't look like I think people think it looks, and I was talking with a friend that still works in the field, and we were talking about harm reduction, having one of those fun off the record conversations that you can't have in front of management.
Yeah,
Um, because there is housing that says you can't get high in housing,
right.
and the place where we worked was known for housing, doing permanent supportive housing. And even if you were in permanent supportive housing that said that you couldn't have drugs, they would go to the person's house before um, a visit and make sure they got all the paraphernalia out
Right.
so we
Yeah.
could keep their housing. Um, the model is also difficult when you look at a place like San Francisco. You didn't talk about this too much in your piece, and I don't know what you saw in Philadelphia. It sounds like you're a native. There's a transient population in San Francisco as well. I wrote about this in the piece that you can get on Patreon. Just kidding. Um, but when San Francisco started doing their encampment sweeps last year, they found that 90% of the people uh, that denied housing weren't from the city. Or 90, first of all, 90% of the people denied housing. And the majority of those people weren't from San Francisco. So harm reduction to a lot of people that work in the field is a hard thing to try to reckon with when people are just passing through because you don't really have roots in that area. So what is there really for you to want to get clean when you're so disconnected from any of your social bonds, your familial bonds?
Yeah. No. And in Philly, it's the same. I mean, I don't know the extent to which the population in Kensington is from, how far. I'm sure San Francisco, given that it has a much higher profile of a city and the weather is nicer,
Yeah.
um, you probably get people from much further,
Yeah.
afield. But I know in Philly, like it's not necessarily residents of Kensington that are on Kensington Avenue.
Gotcha.
And a lot of people will talk about friends of theirs who've been lost to Kensington Avenue, from South Philly or West Philly or North Philly.
Mhm.
That Kensington kind of acts as the vacuum that sucks people up from all over the place, and outside the city, Jersey, wherever people can go. I mean, it's well known now that it's the largest open air drug market on the East Coast, and you
Wow.
can you can get drugs pretty easily. And there are a number of nonprofits there practicing the harm reduction model,
Mhm.
which offers a lot of advantages if you're somebody who wants to be addicted, who wants to stay in that world.
Mhm.
And I think this is the main problem, right? Like we have to ask ourselves, what is the goal of drug policy? Is it to eradicate addiction, or is it to make sure people don't overdose, right? And those are very different
Mhm.
goals, and they
Yeah.
have very different levels of ambition.
What do you and you didn't talk about this person in your piece, and I was kind of looking forward to, to asking you your opinion because I'm kind of all over the place on this gentleman as well. I'm sure you've heard this name. I believe his name is Carl Hart.
Oh, the
He's the
heroin guy?
yeah,
Yeah,
the heroin
yes.
guy. He's the guy that's like, look, man, drugs aren't addictive. Drugs aren't a problem. I just did a big fat rail of meth before I came here, and look, no sores.
Right,
I'm gonna do some heroin later, and maybe, just maybe, I'm gonna call some prostitutes and do a bunch of blow.
right.
Um,
Yeah, I mean,
it's
I think that if you're somebody who has he's like an Ivy League professor?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
but he comes from the streets.
right, yeah. Um, I think that if you're somebody who has the kind of income and stability of an Ivy League professor and who has a social world and network that's kind of strong and thick,
Mhm,
maybe it's possible to casually do drugs and not suffer any consequences. But you know as well as I, most of the people who are in encampments addicted to fentanyl or opioids or trank, um, these people are not from thick social worlds with decent salaries. They're people who are very poor and often come from very weak, social environments. They didn't have, good jobs, or they didn't have strong family connections or lots of friends and a support group. And those are the people that suffer from drug use. And this is why, I say that the main problem of Kensington is it's a social problem more than anything. I think
mhm,
we often confuse certain political problems as if they're kind of isolated, or you could just kind of turn off the tap and then that one single problem will go away. But drug abuse and drug addiction is a problem of social failure. And if
yeah,
you have everything else in your life is steady and cool, if you're a professional class person and you're living wherever you're living, and probably in like Brooklyn or New Haven or somewhere in a nice leafy urban core where it's pretty low crime and nice happy neighborhood, yeah, maybe you could do heroin every once in a while. It's not a problem. But to act like that's the modal experience of the working class and the poor is extremely irresponsible. And what frustrates me about Hart is he gets in the pages of the New York Times and acts as if his social life can just be exported to places like Kensington, Philadelphia, or you know, the ghettos of these post-industrial cities where people don't have anything, you know,
Yeah.
and that's just not true. It's extremely harmful to pretend like drugs are just, like anything else.